Welcome to the Sports Science Dudes. I'm your host, Dr. Jose Antonio, with my co-host, Dr. Tony Ricci. If you're a first-time listener, hit the subscribe button and like the show. You can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Our special guest today is Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. I assume I pronounced that right, Feigenbaum.
It's close enough. It's close enough. Feigen. When I went to Germany, they said it's Feigenbaum, right? Which is just how you said it. But we've been saying Feigenbaum my whole life, right? And so I don't know, like I can't go back and fix my family. Somebody messed it up, and I don't. Anyway, yeah, I don't know.
Feigenbaum and Feigenbaum. Okay, well, there's two ways to say it.
Yeah.
You're a physician, strength coach, and a competitive powerlifter. That's super cool. You started Barbell Medicine in an effort to combine the best of modern medicine and strength and conditioning. You're passionate about a variety of issues related to public health, education, and sport. And just a little bit about your educational background. You went to Truman State University, got your BS in biology. Truman.
Yep. Yes,
I mean,
sir.
Hopefully people will now know about
now we'll know. Yeah.
Truman. You got your master's in anatomy and physiology in 2012 at St. Louis University School of Medicine, and then you did your medical degree at Eastern Virginia Medical School. So I want to welcome the good doctor to the Sports Science Dudes.
All right.
Thanks for having me. I just I had a powerlifting meet on Saturday, so I still walking the walk and doing all this stuff, and happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, that's great. You know what's sort of as an aside, we'll be having our 21st annual conference for the International Society of Sports Nutrition. So I've been doing research, and Tony, to some extent, working more in the strength and conditioning realm, research in the sports nutrition supplement area. And I'm always happy to meet physicians who know the category, because I'll tell you what, it's actually rare. And just to give you an idea, people are like, hey, could you know an MD or DO that knows anything about so-and-so? I'm like,
It's tough.
It's hard to find. And when I saw you on Twitter, I'm like, hey, we got an MD who actually knows strength and conditioning, he knows nutrition. Obviously, you're self-taught in this, because this isn't typical stuff you learn in medical school. So could you tell Tony and I a little bit about how you came about with Barbell Medicine? Are you sitting in med school and you're like sitting in a physiology class? You're like, this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. We need to do something to educate future physicians. So how'd you come up with it, Jordan?
Yes, no, that's a great question. My path into medicine was actually, at the time, it was they just called it non-traditional. So I graduated, I opened a gym, I was a strength coach full time. That was my thing. And in fact, that's actually how I met you the first time in like 2009 in Orlando at the CSCC or SCCC, whatever it was, in Orlando. And so I went into medical school kind of having this background, not only as a competitive powerlifter, but also as a strength coach and being involved in that. And I thought, well, surely there's going to be some crossover here between medicine and sort of the health aspects of eating a health promoting dietary pattern, exercise promotion, things of that nature. It wasn't there at all. Even, maybe we could be charitable and say, yeah, they paid lip service to, sure, people should be eating healthier and should be more active. But there was nothing prescriptive in there as far as like, here's how we're going to do the behavioral change counseling. Here are the targets we should be shooting for, like the dietary guidelines, for example, the exercise guidelines, for example. And so one of my senior capstone courses, you had to do a quality improvement project to hey, what do you want to do in medicine and how are you going to improve things? And I was like, well, let's just see first off, how many physicians even are aware of the exercise guidelines? Do they know them? And then of those who know them, how many are actually, recommending it to their patients in any form, even if it's just the most rudimentary, like here's a pamphlet. Right. And so at the time, this was 2015, less than 10% of primary care physicians that we surveyed, a couple thousand of them, even knew that the exercise guidelines existed. Wow. Less than 10%. Of the 10%, less than half of them were actively recommending it to their patients at the time. And it's like, okay, huge opportunity. And so I had started Barbell Medicine as like a blog for me to just publish stuff based on here's my strength and conditioning background. Here's what I'm learning in medicine. How do I bring these two together? I just didn't really know where I was going to go with it, other than it was a cathartic way for me to kind of write what was on my mind, put out information. And then that got honed in on as I went through some more medical training and realized, okay, there's a big opportunity here to do good in the community by training up other healthcare providers on this sort of stuff. And before you started recording, kind of made mention of there's not a lot of good doctors in the space that know about this. And that's true. on the one hand, you kind of want physicians to work up to their level of training, right? I don't necessarily care if my primary care physician is like, does he know the latest and greatest on, exercise volume prescription for maximum gains? Like, well, no, but I do want them to know enough to be recommending exercise to their patients and not recommending against things like resistance training, even heavy resistance training to their patients. Like, oh, it's going to hurt you or it's going to, be dangerous for you, because that's a big fear. It's a big barrier for people to participate in exercise. And so you want them to know enough not to kind of dissuade people from participating if they otherwise would, and know enough to like get a foothold with their patients and recommend them to be more active and direct them appropriately. So that's kind of how this all came together. It was just me in 2012 to 2015. We're one man kind of shop. And now there's, almost 50 or 60 of us kind of rolling around on the internet and in places all over the world trying to spread the word. Yeah. Disciples,
That's
if you will.
awesome. Yeah.
So it's fun. Yeah. We're doing the thing. It's
So
it's
this
fun.
so you're basically trying to educate, you're educating everyone, not just physicians, obviously.
Sure.
And you're doing it mostly virtually. Do you have face-to-face or in-person seminars with groups of people?
Yeah, so we've done about 40 something live in-person seminars where we kind of cover, all right, here are the top 10 reasons why people go see physicians. Where's that sort of intersection between what we would call like lifestyle, so exercise, dietary pattern change, sleep, stuff like that, and modern medicine. And so on the one hand, yes, you need physicians, other healthcare providers to know about exercise, its benefits, how to prescribe it, how to recommend it, and maybe assuage some of their concerns over it. So for example, if a patient had high blood pressure that was not really well controlled, is it safe for them to exercise? It's like, look, we have all this data. Yeah, in fact, not only is it safe, it's actually beneficial. But also trainers, coaches, strength enthusiasts or exercise enthusiasts want to know, like, well, where does modern medicine fit into this? Like, if I'm doing all this exercise, eating this particular dietary pattern, and I still have, in the case of blood pressure, elevated blood pressure or hypertension, what then? What sort of medications are available? Like, what would be best for me as an athlete? And so we're kind of doing the full spectrum here. We're literally bringing the best of modern medicine to strength conditioning and vice versa. That's kind of our tagline. So yeah, that's what we're aiming to do. We do live in-person stuff. We do remote education, publish stuff, Awesome. Although I don't know that people are reading the things, if you come up to an article that's 10,000 words long, like, I don't know how many people are making it to the end, but we hope people are. So we'll see.
I think our generation makes it to the end, but the younger, I think, are a bit more visually stimulated, right? And video based. And
They want the TikTok thing. Yeah. They want, all right, in 30 seconds, teach me what I need to know. And I'm like, okay, I don't have a good dance moves, but we'll work on it. So
do you think, my father was a physician. He had implored me to go to medical school when I was an undergrad. And my thing was, I didn't like being around sick people. So that kind of turned it off for me. But
sure.
I remember that he apparently wasn't, and I'm just a kid. I'm like, he's an expert on drugs. I mean, sure. He has I remember going to his office, he'd have a drug for this, a drug for that. And so that was my introduction to modern medicine. So I guess the question is, are we expecting too much from Western or allopathic medicine, such that people seem to want their physician to be, hey, give me nutrition advice, give me exercise advice. Oh, if I'm sick, if I have an infection, give me this antibiotic, or maybe don't give it to me because it might ruin my gut microbiome. Are we expecting too much from the profession? Because I seem to think a lot of people, like, for instance, there's no, I was about to use the word Rolodex. No one even knows what that means anymore. There's not a Rolodex of scientists. You can't look up scientists, but everyone has a physician.
Totally.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think where I kind of fall on this is that you want the physician to know enough about the important contributors to a person's health trajectory, right? The determinants of their health, to be able to set them on the right path. And so from like a strictly medical based care, you want them to be up on all the latest evidence, all the latest practice guidelines, and this, that, and the other, to be able to treat, again, if it's your primary care physician, elevated blood pressure, blood sugar abnormalities, right, heart disease risk, this, that, and the other. When it comes to exercise and nutrition, you don't necessarily need them or maybe even want them to be an exercise or nutrition expert, because they don't have enough time in the office to actually do that appropriately. What you would like them to do, though, is to be a facilitator. Okay, here is a trainer or a coach or another professional that I can refer you to that I have a good relationship with. I know they're evidence-based as well. Go see, whoever down the street. Well, ideally down the hall, so you're limiting that barrier, right, that people have. that's what you'd really want. And just it's unfortunate because when you look at, again, the amount of exercise counseling, dietary pattern counseling that actually happens in the office, it's very, very poor. Not only like as far as frequency, just doesn't happen that often, but the stuff that does happen, it's just not meeting the sort of points of performance that you would want to see for effective behavior change counseling. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to change behaviors. And so you can't do that in a 5-minute visit, right? Or even, you know, a 10-minute visit. You really need more time. And if you're seeing 30 patients a day, good luck. Yeah, that's tough. So I think there's, you know, on some of it is the modern medicine kind of system that we're working within. That's tough. And then other things, other barriers for physicians and other healthcare professionals is just fund of knowledge stuff. If you don't know anything about exercise, if you don't know anything about nutrition, especially, again, the behavior change components of those things and the current guidelines, I don't really know how you discuss this with any level of confidence. And in fact, when you poll physicians like, hey, you're not recommending exercise to your patients, why? The reasons why they cite that they're not actually recommending it comes down to time, expertise. They feel like I don't really know what I'm doing. And then like personal, like participation. So our thought was like, all right, if we can train up the physicians on like, here are the guidelines, you don't need to like memorize them, but know that they exist and that you can reference them. And then also get them more active, walking the walk, so to speak. So they need to do it too. They're humans, right? So right. If you can get them involved, they are likely to feel more comfortable, and then also have that reference like, oh, and here's what we should be striving for at a minimum for exercise. But again, it's an uphill battle. And if, like I said, less than 10% of physicians, primary care physicians, even know that the exercise guidelines exist, if we could get that number up to 30%, boy,
big difference. Yeah.
Huge. Yeah. Huge potential upside there. And so there are a lot of campaigns and public sort of health initiatives trying to get this going. And I think it's going to come down to having more money being made available and more, you know, incentives, whether it's in the electronic medical record for like, hey, you got to check this box, did counsel patient on exercise, did counsel patient on nutrition, and referred them appropriately. If that's in there, if it's a checkbox and, you know, that's somehow linked into the electronic referral system, maybe it gets better. But our role here, I think, is more educational, and then also maybe just make awareness. And we'll see how that changes over the next decade or so.
Just a quick question, if I may. I don't think, but at least modern education, when I was younger, definitely there were physicians that, like you said, you made a brief, quick mention of almost actually dissuading you from resistance training as an example.
Totally.
That can't still exist, though. It doesn't.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep.
Really?
Yeah. And again, so it's not great data. For great data, you'd want stuff that's repeated, like surveys data that's repeated regularly to get a good sense of things. But in general, physicians tend to be, they recognize the potential that exercise has for modifying disease trajectory and people's overall quality of life and functional scores and this, that, and the other. But again, when it comes down to their sort of fears surrounding exercise, there's a lot of, we would call harmful language by which they discuss exercise through things like, oh yeah, if you lift heavy, you know, your body's like a car, it's going to break down over time, and, you know, you might hurt yourself. And it's like, or even the description of like very common medical ailments like osteoarthritis, for example. Oh yeah, it's a wear and tear thing, problem with the joints. And it's like, great, so what should I do about that, doc? And they're like, well, you should exercise. And you're like, you just told me that it's a wear and tear thing. You're saying I should do more wear and tear to get better? That doesn't really doesn't really work. Or even things with like osteoporosis. Okay, your bone mineral density is less, and so we need to kind of load the bones to make them grow. And you're like, but the bones are brittle. That's what you said. I'm at risk of fracture. Like how do you, you know, square that circle? And so yeah, it's that's happening. Even stuff that's been disproved for decades and decades, like resistance training doesn't stunt growth in the pediatric population.
Yeah.
Still out there. And you would think we've got to be past this. But again, to Dr. Antonio's point earlier, because it's not a part of the training that happens throughout medical school, you have medical graduates getting into residency and all the way through residency who have no exposure to any of this stuff. And so yeah, and so it just kind of persists. I mean, one of the famous sort of lines in medicine is like, the time lapse between when new guidelines come out and actual practice change occurs is about 17 years, which is 17 and a half years. Yeah. And so is it like a generational thing? Like we need another generation to come through, like where exercise is sexy and cool and like more widely accepted? Yeah, maybe, I don't know. But I think even if you had like a single lecture throughout medical training that was like, here are the exercise guidelines, here's why exercise is safe, here's, you know, how many people are not currently sufficiently active, and here's what you should do about it, I feel like that could move the needle forward. Same thing with nutrition. You poll a group of interns. So these are people who have graduated medical school. They're in their residency, first year residency. And you ask them very basic nutrition questions. Things like, hey, how many calories are in a gram of protein, carbohydrates, fat, right? And these are very intelligent people. They've demonstrated they're very smart. They're like, I don't know, less than 5% gets the answers correct. They can't do a multiple choice answer and tell you, yeah, protein on average has 4 kilocalories of energy, for example. And you're like, okay, so maybe my physician is not a good resource for nutrition and exercise. That's okay, fine. But there shouldn't be any sort of a harm associated with the counseling. Like,
Right.
don't lift weights, just walk more. Usually that's not going to be sufficient enough for most folks. Or, hey, don't worry about your diet. We've got some medications. It's like,
Yeah.
well, let's not do both. Let's do both, right? That's the goal. So
Actually, you bring up interesting the diet and medication conundrum, and I want your opinion. And this is sort of off topic, but your opinion of the use of Ozempic for treating obesity or overweight, and also, I don't know if this is true, but the possibility of even using it for childhood obesity.
yeah.
Philosophically, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh boy. Well, we'll see how maybe this will be we'll get some hate mail out of this. Yeah, no, I'm a fan. These anti-obesity medications, of which Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, all of them are would be in that category. They represent a real opportunity, in my estimation, to put a dent in the obesity epidemic. The issue here, when people are like, all right, well, it doesn't treat the cause. What's the root cause of obesity? And it's like, well, our genes really haven't changed. There's not enough time for that to have changed. What's really changed has been our food environment. Food environment is replete with high calorie, very tasty, easily available, cheap foods that are not very filling, not very satiating. And it's like, yeah, we can't really do anything about that in the short term. Yes, policy change would be helpful, but that's policy change at the community level, at the state level, and big agri, like at every step of the game. So it's like, what can we do? Lifestyle change alone, just getting people to exercise and engage in dietary pattern change through intensive lifestyle counseling works about 20% of the time to achieve what's called clinically significant weight loss, which is at least 5% weight loss that's maintained for at least a year. At a 5-year mark, that number drops by half. And you're like, okay, so some people are going to do well on this. They respond well to that sort of intervention. They have, as my grandmother would say, the chutzpah to stick with it. But then it's like, all right, well, what about the other 80%? Okay, so let's look at the data on anti-obesity medications. And in adults, about 75, 80% of them will respond favorably and have at least that 5% weight loss, whereas 2/3 will have something like 15 or 20% weight loss. And it's like, wow, that represents an additional sort of benefit. But the way I view those medications, they're sort of behavioral change agents. And I think looking at it through that lens, it allows people to do the dietary pattern thing with less sort of exertion, less sort of mental fortitude or willpower or whatever that you need to stick with it. And it's like, we use other behavior change sort of strategies to get people to exercise, eat appropriately. For example, modifying the home food environment. If you don't have trash in the home, you're less likely to eat it. Okay, well, if we had a medication that allowed people to choose to do the right thing more often, that seems like a win. And so the American Academy of Pediatrics recently came out with some recommendations talking about more stringent screening criteria and the potential for using these anti-obesity medications in that population. And based on the preliminary data that's been published, it's not as much data as we have in the adults. It does look pretty promising. And I think about most diseases, as far as like cumulative exposure, right? Like a short-term exposure to high blood pressure, for example, not particularly risky unless it's crazy, crazy high. But yeah, it's the lifelong exposure to elevated or high blood pressure. Same thing with diabetes, same thing with heart disease and exposure to high levels of LDL and other atherogenic sort of lipoproteins. And so you think about obesity. The issue here is how many years have you lived with excess adipose tissue? Like smoking, same thing. Mm-hmm. How many pack years has a person been exposed to? If we can reduce that by reducing the rate of childhood obesity, thereby reducing the rate of adult obesity, then we're also likely to see less sort of adiposity-based chronic disease burden because there's been less exposure. So, and the food environment isn't changing anytime soon either. So I'm kind of in favor of them. I can see people's resistance to it. They're like, they view it, lay people will view it like, well, we're just putting a Band-Aid on it. We're giving people a pill instead of lifestyle stuff. And it's like, the problem is our environment, really. And I don't know that that's going to change anytime soon. So I'm in favor of it with appropriate restrictions, appropriate screening tools and guidance and monitoring. I think that's probably better than just burying our heads in the sand and telling people to just try harder. The old Nike kind of approach, just do it.
Right.
Or using the same strategy we've been using for the past half a millennia, shame and blame, like, oh, this is your problem, work harder, fix it. It's like, do you want the people to get better? Because if so, we have some opportunities, and just the last thing I'll say on this, there's been a liberalization of bariatric surgery recommendations. So before it was like, oh, BMI had to be at least 45, for example, or it could be 40 with a single obesity related disease. And now it's lowered by 10. It's like, look, you could have a BMI of 30 and a single obesity related disease, and you're supposed to get screened for maybe you're a candidate for bariatric surgery. Or if your BMI is 35 and you have no obesity related disease, you should potentially be screened for bariatric surgery. And people are like, that's low. That's not a high BMI. Why would you do this? Well, again, you're reducing the lifelong exposure. And then thing two, you have healthier patients ending up on the surgical table. So there's less complications. So they ultimately tend to do better. And that's kind of the way I see it as both like a physician and then also just a person involved like in public health. It's like, we need to have multiple options, multiple levers to pull for different folks based on how they respond. If somebody is off to the races on lifestyle change, great. Gold star, you win a prize. But the people who don't, we need another, what's the next level? What's the next level of intervention? It's the same thing you would do with exercise, right? Like, all right, here's a standard program, let's get you going or whatever. If a person doesn't respond to that, they need some tweaks, different levers to pull to get them stronger, gain more muscle mass, gain more cardiorespiratory fitness. And that's what we would do anyway. So that's kind of where I stand.
That's what, and I see that logic, and I think it's well articulated. Just anecdotally, I know quite a few people using it because of my age. They're and I hope it leads to some behavioral change. But what I found, and again, this is just observation of maybe 20 people, they eat less, and it's garbage, and their appetite is just down. I guess obviously the digestion time is longer. My concern is to, maybe lean tissue preservation and almost nutrient deficiency, because I don't see them eating anything anymore unless they're doing that when they're not with me, obviously. But
yeah, there's some concern over this like low energy availability, whether it's going to be systemic, right? Because they're eating less calories. In general, we think the way these medications work is that they improve feelings of fullness or satiety in response to a meal. And then in addition, reduce appetite overall. And so people will eat very few calories, but that's what you would want to happen in a perfect world anyways, right? If you had a healthy level of body fat, you'd basically want to be at energy balance to support that healthy level of body fat. And on days when you eat more calories, those energy stores expand. And so your body kind of compensates by saying, I'm going to eat less the next day and because I'm fuller sooner. But in many folks, these obesity sensitive individuals, which is a large swath of the population, that doesn't happen. They maintain energy balance at a higher than normal, higher than healthy level of body fat. And so like, how do we restore this relationship, this appetite satiety relationship? The medications seem to do that. In the data on this, you're exactly right with the low energy availability thing, particularly with respect to protein. It seems like people are not eating a good amount of protein. Right. The average protein intake in the United States on people not on these medications is somewhere about 1 gram per kilo body weight in adults. Yeah. And so when people are on these medications, they're far below that, far below even the RDA. And so you're like, all right, so maybe there's some additional risk of lean tissue wasting just due to low protein intake. And if they're not exercising, again, you could have this sort of two hit sort of thing. You're like, not enough protein, not exercising. Like, yeah, you could lose a lot of lean body mass. I will say though, when you compare it to the amount of lean body mass loss with bariatric surgery or in lifestyle change, it seems to be somewhat similar. In fact, there's only been one study showing like a higher than predicted amount of lean body mass loss. But again, you'd really want to know, are these people exercising? If not, we would expect more lean body mass loss. Are they eating enough protein? If not, you would expect more lean body mass loss. And I think there's only been one study addressing like functional sort of performance, like strength. And in general, strength drop off hasn't been significant. And you would expect, again, if there's a huge muscle cross-sectional area loss due to these medications, that there would be a drop in performance. I don't suspect Ozempic or any other of these anti-obesity medications to be like a PED where people are going to start using them just to like make weight or whatever. But at the same time, you would want the sort of lifestyle recommendations to accompany the prescription of these anti-obesity medications. You wouldn't want an either or situation. You'd want both. But to your point, there are going to be people that won't do the lifestyle stuff, right? And they'll just get the medication, you know, but it's like, I'm kind of willing to accept that risk because I think even with the muscle mass loss, it's probably still better than the exposure to excess adiposity.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think as Tony mentioned, you articulate it well. I think people need to realize there's a trade-off with any of these decisions. If you go into medication, I mean, there's your basic risk benefit analysis. Okay, so you will lose body fat, which is really the primary goal. You might be calorically deficient, okay, and the trade-off is you might lose lean body mass, but I guess depending on how much excess adipose tissue you carry, that's where you have to make that judgment, and everyone will be different. Now, I want to segue this into, I saw a video of you and I think your colleague, I forget his name, but
Austin, yeah,
you did it was an interesting segment on, the question was, can you have too much muscle? And before I ask the question, let me preface it with height and longevity. Apparently, there's an inverse relationship. Tall people do not live as long as short people. And anecdotally, you see that. You don't really see old people who are 7 feet tall. They all tend to be small people.
Sure.
And then, of course, we know the relationship between, BMI and longevity. If it tends to be high, you don't live as long. And if your BMI is over 30, you're not a bodybuilder. I mean, it's not like there's bodybuilders walking around when they do these population-based studies. You're overweight or obese. So my question to you is, can you carry too much muscle such that it is a detriment vis-a-vis longevity or lifespan?
Yeah, I think my simple answer to that would be unlikely, unless you're also carrying too much body fat, and that's why you're carrying the too much muscle mass, right? It's hard to separate the two things. In general, people that carry a lot of muscle mass also tend to carry more body fat. And so my kind of inflection point there is when people's BMI get above 30 and or their waist circumference is in excess of the current cutoffs that diagnose like particularly abdominal obesity, abdominal adiposity, which for most men of European descent is somewhere in that 37-inch range. That's the sort of conservative cutoff. And then 40 inches, the more like, okay, look, do not pass go, do not collect $200, that sort of thing. So if you're in that field, I don't necessarily care how much muscle you have above and beyond that. I feel like the risk of carrying too much adipose tissue outweighs the potential benefit of carrying more muscle mass. But to your point, people are like, well, what about this bodybuilder? Or what about this, what about Thor? What about, whoever else? And it's like, okay, so that's a statistical outlier. They're not even being captured by this data, thing one, right? Thing two, in order to achieve the level of muscularity and body weight, body mass, to have a BMI greater than 30, but a waist circumference below 37 inches.
That's a unicorn.
Right. It's not only a unicorn, but then I started thinking about, well, what about polypharmacy? The risks from that is probably far in excess of what we're talking about with body fat, for example. But I don't think muscle in and of itself is particularly harmful even at a high level, unless concomitantly you're rolling around with a bunch of excess body fat, or you used particular methods of getting there that have their own risks. That's kind of my stance on that.
And might that be even particularly more true if, not that, a PED could not be used effectively, but if it's a naturally occurring level of muscle mass,
right,
then I would think your body's well equipped to probably, again, with the reduction in body fat and all other factors being where they should be, because at my age, I hold a lot more than I want. I don't use any PEDs. I don't even TRT. I have nothing against it. But I do have a lot of muscle for my age, and that concerns me. Is that, that don't concern me, but is it decreasing longevity? And, body fat stays in the teens, high teens, but it does at my old age. So you're saying probably then that if it's, if all of the variables are there in the right place, other than increased muscle mass, you'll probably be okay then, longevity.
Yeah. And in fact, I would say having excess muscle mass we'll call it excess, right? So just above like what we consider healthy. I think that gives you a big physiological reserve, right? Should something happen,
Okay.
you have to go to the hospital for some reason, you have some illness for some reason where you lose some muscle mass. It's like, well, now you have a physiological reserve, a physical 401k to withdraw from. Whereas the people with a low level of muscle mass, well, they're up a creek because they have nothing to draw from. And we know that low levels of muscle mass increase mortality risk. When people go into the hospital, there's a relationship between their creatinine level, for example, which is just a measure of how much muscle mass is being turned over in kidney function.
Yeah.
And it's like, if they have a really low level of creatinine, we know that unless their kidneys are working overtime, which is not usually the case when people go to the hospital, that they're carrying a low amount of muscle mass. And that has a really strong correlation to in-hospital mortality. Wow, and so there's like a baseline, look, you need at least this much muscle mass for us to like sign off on you. Like no risk of sarcopenia, no risk of like functional disorders. You can live a full and complete life, go with God. Above that, again, I think you're hedging your bets. Like, look, if something bad happens, you can make a withdrawal and again, not be up a creek. And further, your performance is likely to be higher. Maybe the process of gaining that muscle mass, you enjoy it. That's all health promoting. I just can't see a point where it's like, nope, that's too much muscle mass. It's too costly from like a energy economy standpoint where you're like something bad. I haven't seen any data suggesting that until, again, I guess you see that the people have too much body fat accompanying that amount of muscle mass, or again, have used particular substances to get there. But to your point, look, the genetic freaks in the population, that's only going to continue to increase as like athletes start mating with more and more athletes. And like, you're just going to get these hyper jacked, super tall people coming out and they're like, my BMI is 35, my body fat's 10%, I'm lifetime natural, and I'm carrying tons of muscle mass. Like, well, I wish I had your parents, but
although Travis Kelce may be watering down his genes with Taylor Swift.
Right,
I don't know right now.
Right. We need more D1 babies. Like, how do we pair these people up? So,
I think it's fascinating, the whole idea of, carrying too much muscle mass as it relates to longevity. I'll rephrase the question this way, because most of us, like Tony trains, he doesn't like lifting weights because oddly enough, he gains muscle too easily, which is kind of crazy,
Hate to see it. Yeah.
For an old guy.
I actually quit, I honestly got sick of the gym. I quit lifting, God, probably 5 or 10 years ago. And I transitioned almost all of my training to stand-up paddling. Because my backyard's on the water, so I just drop a board in the water and I take off. Yeah. So we all have our goals, and obviously you're a power lifter, but when I phrase the question this way, it's interesting how people will respond. So my question to you, Jordan, is if your goal was to live as long as possible, would you change the way you train?
Oh, yeah. Okay. No, that's a great question. Yeah. So I just had a powerlifting meet. My last deadlift, for example, is 733 pounds, right? At the time, going to the meet, I was like, I just want to lift as much weight as humanly possible. Right. So I made a number of compromises in order to do that. I pared back my conditioning training. So I race dirt bikes too. That's like my,
cool.
That's where I started. In fact, that's how I got into lifting weights at all. I dislocated my hip when I was 18 and I couldn't walk for 3 months. And then when I had to start rehabbing, the home PT was like, you need to do squats. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And I got into lifting weights and I was like, this is real fun. So in any case, to be conditioned for that sport, I do quite a bit of conditioning, somewhere on the, 3 hours, 4 hours a week total, usually on a road bike or a rower, or I'm actually doing some riding. But to get ready for the powerlifting meet, I cut that down into half at first. And then by the last week, I probably did an hour total of conditioning the last week before the meet. If I was trying to live as long as possible, I don't think my training would look a lot like getting ready for a powerlifting meet. I would likely still resistance train, and it could be done with compound lifts, could be done with barbells if that's my preference. But I would aim for improving my cardiorespiratory fitness to a much higher level. Because again, we know there's this dose dependent relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness and sort of reduced heart disease risk. And if that's the number one killer in the United States and in adults, maybe worldwide, okay, I can see dedicating or allocating more training time to improving that. So I would just do more cardio, but I would still lift weights. So I would likely carry less muscle mass because more of my training resources would be dedicated to improving cardiorespiratory fitness, but I don't know how much less muscle mass. I mean, I weighed in at 208 for the meet. I'd probably weigh, I don't know, 200 to 205 with a higher level of conditioning and maybe be 10% weaker.
Right.
That hey, if I can keep that, I'm 38. I'll be 40 in a few years. Like if I could keep that through most of my fifth decade into my 50s, man, I'd be a happy guy. So
No, hey, it's interesting how people will alter what they do if the goal is to live longer, which tells me a lot. It tells me most people do not train to live longer. They train because they like what they do.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which might be the most important thing. I mean, we always talk about lifespan, health span versus lifespan.
Totally.
If you keep doing what you're doing, Jordan, you're going to be healthy. So at the end of the day, that's all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
I want to segue into a little what I have a friend of mine in the UK. He's a physician. He gets quite annoyed with what he calls celebrity doctors and scientists.
Oh boy.
And he's always sending me, he's like, you're not going to believe what this guy said. I'm like, yeah, believe me, I get the same stuff.
Sure, yeah.
And part of this is the reason this comes up is you had tweeted something as it relates to some claims Andrew Huberman makes, but also you could always. I've had people ask me about some of the claims Peter Attia has made, and let me go to one where he talks about zone 2 training and longevity.
Sure.
And for the life of me, when you look at zone 2 training, because he's big on cardiovascular fitness for longevity, which of course makes sense. You had mentioned that already. The problem I have with that is, first of all, no one knows their heart rate when they train. In fact, I don't even know my heart rate when I train, and I do a lot of cardio. And he also talks about max VO2. We work in an exercise science lab. None of us know our own max VO2. So how is he making these claims when people who are in the field don't even know that data?
Yeah, no, that's tough. I mean, there's a lot of hype around zone 2 training, right? And I get these questions all the time and I'm like, oh, cool. Well, what's zone 2 training? And people are like, oh, well, it's like this heart rate percentage of your max heart rate. I'm like, great. So how do you figure out your max heart rate? And they're like, oh, a formula. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work. And then more accurately, that's not going to transfer from exercise to exercise to exercise. You would have a different range for bicycle, for a treadmill, for a rower, for a ski erg, for a stair. Like it's modality specific, right? And so, in fact, probably one of the best resources on this is Joel Friel. He was a senior USA's men's cycling coach, and he talks about using this sort of functional training threshold, where effectively you do a piece all out, max intensity. You find what is your max heart rate at this particular modality, and then you can use percentages of that to train in different zones.
That makes sense. Yep.
Yeah. And ideally you would have a blood lactate meter as well to kind of figure out like, okay,
we all have those.
So, right, exactly. But the point of like zone 2 would be you're right at that threshold where blood lactate has risen a little bit, but is staying right where it's, should be just, right, just around 2 or just below that, something like that. And it's only good for a month and you got to retest and then recalibrate. So in any case, that's all problems with like just defining zone 2 and like prescribing zone 2, right? The next problem would be then, okay, so let's say we have no problems with describing it, finding it, whatever. Well, then is there good data that zone 2 compared to zone 1 or zone 3 or zone 4 at an equal volume or equal total work done promotes a more favorable health trajectory? Do people have less risk of heart disease or less mortality from heart disease? Do they have a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes? Like, is there some tangible benefit that we have good longitudinal data on? And the answer to that is no. The answer to that is no. So when people are like zone 2 is better, it's like, then what? Then nothing? Yes, agreed.
Yeah, absolutely.
You could make maybe a tangential or sort of inference sort of argument that zone 2 would be more favorable than zone 1 if you have to make a number of leaps here. There's data looking at people like endurance athletes who spend more time in zone 2 than zone 1 for their moderate intensity conditioning. And then they look at measures of their VO2 max, for example, and the people who spend more time in zone 2 have a higher VO2 max than people who spend more time in zone 1. Okay, so then we have to make the next leap to say, well, look, VO2 max is a good measurement of cardiorespiratory fitness. And we know if there's a dose-dependent relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, having a higher VO2 max would be likely to improve your health trajectory. But we don't, again, have that longitudinal data. We've made a number of assumptions and inferences to get to that point. So what I would say is that, yes, moderate intensity conditioning is useful, full stop. But as far as whether that needs to be zone 2, zone 1.5, zone 1, zone 2, I can't tell you. And again, I think the problem is the prescription. Even with the current exercise guidelines, right? It's like everybody needs to do 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity or moderate to vigorous physical activity, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity activity. And they're like, okay, cool. Well, what's moderate and vigorous? And they're like, we're going to use METs. We're going to use METs
yeah.
to prescribe this. So you need 500 to 1,000 MET minutes of physical activity of conditioning per week. And then it's like, well, the MET, the unit was derived from one dude, a 70-kilo guy sitting in a chair. And now we extrapolate this to the MET compendium. It's like, well, your MET cost for an activity is different than mine, is different than my dad's, is different than my brother's. And so how can we use that? So there's been other studies where they look at like, okay, what heart rate is associated with these different MET costs, energy costs, what RPEs are associated with these different sort of MET costs and intensities. And that's where it kind of ends for me, is prescription. So I'm thinking moderate intensity cardio based on this talk test using RPE. Moderate intensity is like RPE 5 to 6. Vigorous intensity would be RPE 7 and higher. And you can use that to sort of prescribe the intensity. And then as far as the distribution of intensity, we'd be thinking 80% of your conditioning should be from this moderate intensity zone, 20% maybe from the vigorous intensity. And how you mix and match that, if whether it's zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4 for vigorous, I don't know. I think it's more shoulder shrug and speculation. But when people make confident claims about zone 2 is the best, I'm like, you got a reference for that? And you do, and not only one reference, do you have like 20 references? Because you're stating it very confidently. And so we're not trying to practice reference-based medicine where you can find a single study showing a single relationship. What you want to know is, what does the totality of the evidence say? And how does that, fit in with your recommendation here? So when people say a thing and they're like, look, one citation, I'm like, great. So there's 20 other studies on this. What do those other 20 say? And then how does that shape your recommendation? And unfortunately, what happens in this space, particularly with influencers and popular folks, is that it's more reference-based than actual evidence-based. But people in the lay public can't really tease that out, but nor do I expect them to, right? How do you become you don't need to become an expert at reading the research just to like get a recommendation. At least you shouldn't have to anyway.
Yeah, I find it amusing when people will post their videos of, look at me, I'm doing zone 2 training and I'm going to live longer. I'm like, you fool, you're probably going to live longer because you're exercising. So
Totally.
It's the precision at which these exercise prescriptions are given that are really annoying. So we're going to play a little word association or phrase association.
Okay.
This is from Dr. Andrew Huberman, and I want your opinion on these.
Okay, sure.
He believes cold water immersion will reduce body fat.
Oh, no. Yeah. No. I mean, I guess assuming the relationship between like brown fat activation or something
Always
like that.
the brown fat.
Yeah. And that's going to increase total daily energy expenditure to a significant degree that persists over months and months and months, by which where energy balance is struck, unlikely. And data to the point suggests otherwise. So no.
However, many people believe that.
Totally. But a new study just came out on cold water immersion and like, how does it fatigue, recovery, ratings of muscle soreness, and effectively it's all a wash. And it's like, look, if you like it, great. But you don't have to, confound or confabulate a reason by which you're doing it. Just say you like the way it feels. That's fine.
Okay, how about this? Tony, do you have something to say about cold waters?
No. I guess if you spent 8 hours in it, there may be a difference, but there'd be other problems if you did such. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, if you live in it, maybe better. Yeah.
Okay, Jordan, how about this? These testosterone boosters, Tongkat, Ali, and Fadogia, Agrestis, elevate testosterone to a degree that is physiologically significant.
Yeah, that seems highly unlikely, given the normal range of testosterone is somewhere between 300 and 800 nanograms per deciliter, and we don't have the existing longitudinal data suggests almost no relationship with people's starting testosterone levels and their sort of gains of muscle mass, muscle strength. Rather, what we think about testosterone based on the current evidence is that we know that people who are in general healthier and more active tend to have higher levels of testosterone compared to folks with diseases that we know lower testosterone, things like high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's like, yes, if you're saying that a person with a higher level of testosterone tends to be healthier than one with lower, sure, but that is more reflective of their current health status rather than predictive in a way. And so, yeah, if you raised somebody's testosterone from 400 nanograms per deciliter to 600 nanograms per deciliter. Thing one, they couldn't feel that. That's a normal sort of day-to-day fluctuation anyway. A biological variation is close to 15% for testosterone. So you couldn't even be sure those two values were actually different, but they don't also predict any additional benefit. If the went from 500 nanograms per deciliter, for example, to 1200 super physiological levels, well, sure. But now we're talking about something different, and it sure as shit isn't Tongkat Ali or Fadogia or whatever. It's testosterone cypionate or some sort of actual testosterone product.
Well, we know Test-Sip works quite well. So
yeah.
Are you, by the way, are you a coffee drinker?
Love coffee.
Okay.
Big coffee guy.
Yeah, I love coffee. Well, one of the funnier posts from Huberman was,
oh no,
he said, when you get up, wake up, you should wait 1.5 to 2 hours before you drink coffee to avoid the afternoon crash.
Totally. Yeah. No, it's like if you're tired when you wake up, you should just wake up later. Like that's the like what? Yeah. And again, I remember this because we got tagged in this post all the time, right? And he's like, well, the adenosine dump that you get, from the coffee, it's like, and it's a paper in mice, right? And it's like, oh, okay. So like, how does this work in humans? And further, your recommendation, is there evidence suggesting that doing this improves cognitive performance, even if subjective ratings of cognitive performance? Nothing. Nothing's out there. And again, it's like going to the doctor and saying, yeah, my elbow hurts when I do dips. And the doctor says, don't do dips. And you're like, okay, that's not really helping me out here. So again, it's a more just reference-based sort of science rather than actual evidence-based, but the people can't really discern the difference. So
what do you think, Tony?
To be honest with you, I wouldn't know the mechanisms enough to really argue about that from the coffee perspective, but I don't see the purpose in that. I mean, I'm from the adenosine side, I'm going to take what Jordan said here, and I'm going to run with that. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. There just isn't, I mean, look, potentially, but it's the certainty, to reiterate, and what you've mentioned in which this is presented, that bothers me more than even it be suggestive or a possibility. I have no problem with looking into possibilities,
sure,
with further research or looking at a mechanism of an action and going, if we did this, and explaining those mechanisms and saying, well, this might be the end result. That's fine. But the conclusive nature of it all is what bothers me. And that discounts any individual variation that exists in individual biochemistry amongst person to person, and outside of having, a head, 2 legs, and 2 arms, and many of the same organs, we're very different.
Totally. Yep.
I guess you could describe it as being confidently wrong. I mean, it's the degree with which minutia is promoted that is really I find it, a bit of it is fascinating, because apparently there's a need for a lot of people. And Jordan, I'm sure when you give talks, people want something easy to follow. It's like, wait, you mean I got to train, 5 or 6 times a week to hit that goal? And I have to clean up the crap that I eat? I mean, can I do something a little easier, like sit in a cold tub for like 10 minutes a day? I mean, it's human behavior. Yeah.
And people want confident claims. They want concrete sort of ideas, right? The actual expert is generally saying, well, most of the time, or in general, and here's what we think now. Yeah. And that's not very confidence inspiring when people hear that, rather than say, do this thing. So I get that. I just imagine the claim was, hey, it may be that if you drink coffee when you first wake up, that there is this particular neurotransmitter or collection of neurotransmitters or other molecules that would be better served by delaying caffeine intake. We don't know that to be sure, but
to my point.
It's possible, right? Exactly, your point. And that tweet, 1, doesn't fit in 160 characters, and 2, gets no traction because people are like, "Wait, what are you actually saying here? It sounds like you're just speculating." Like, I am, in fact, just speculating.
Hey, by the way, one final thing: have you heard the one about the soleus push-up?
Wait, what? No. I know what the soleus is, and I know what a push-up is, but what the heck?
Well, technically, it's plantar flexion, but there's actually an interesting paper where they had people basically bounce their feet. It's your soleus, your gastroc, basically doing plantar flexion for about 4 hours a day.
Okay.
And
Jesus.
right. And we know the contractile activity, promotes changes in skeletal muscle. And Huberman was promoting it as a way to train your muscles, train your soleus. So the idea that people would be bouncing their feet 4 hours a day while they sit at their desk typing.
Oh my God. Waiting for coffee. Waiting for coffee.
Right. Yeah. So I'm like, okay, this is one way to avoid real exercise. You're going to bounce your feet for 4 hours a day. First of all, no one's going to do that.
No. Yeah. And the other thing, it's like, all right. So again, if it's a speculation, like, oh, if you do this for 4 hours a day, you're doing this with energy expenditure, this with muscle training, maybe it works for whatever outcome. And it's like, even if we are charitable and say, yes, it works, but does it work better than this other thing that requires less time, has a larger magnitude of effect? And, you know, if you're asking me, do I think 4 hours of toe tapping or, you know, plantar push-ups or soleus push-ups is better than doing, you know, a couple sets of calf raises to failure and near failure that are loaded appropriately? No, the answer would be, I would say no, just based on, again, existing evidence. Now that may change. And in a decade, we'll have to come back and do another recording and say, hey, you know what? He was onto something, but
Yeah.
Well, Jordan, you will never become a celebrity physician.
I know. Yeah, I know. If I want to look, if I start making super confident claims that are, you know, maybe off the reservation, you'll know that I'm in a world of hurt financially and I need to make some money.
There you go.
That's what I started doing.
Well, Jordan, it's been great having you on the show. Could you tell the audience if they want to reach you, you know, if you're giving a seminar anytime soon, or you travel, give talks at conferences, you know, let the audience know.
Yep. For all of our stuff, you can search Barbell Medicine across platforms. We have a website, has all our media on there, all of our articles, a lot of free downloads, whether it's programming, whether it's nutrition stuff, health stuff. It's all there. We have our podcast, Barbell Medicine. You can find me on Instagram. It's Jordan_Barbell Medicine.
On Instagram right there.
All right, perfect. Yeah. And then we have our main account, Barbell Medicine. So yeah, if you search Barbell Medicine on the World Wide Web, you're going to find a bunch of stuff. Hopefully nothing bad. I'm still waiting for something for that to happen. But yeah, that you can find us there.
Hey, I do want to let you know that at the ISSN conference, we need more physicians there. I think literally there's like 2 physicians that attend our conference that have an interest in sports nutrition. Obviously, you have that interest. You and your colleagues should, you know, come to our conference. It's always in Florida, so it's typically on the beach. I mean, you know, you're going West Coast, East Coast, but it's always mid-June. Next year, it's in Bonita Springs, which is right outside of Fort Myers, and it's June.
Very pretty park too.
Yeah, it's very pretty. June 18, 19, and 20. It's a 2.5-day conference.
You had me at Florida because there's some good golf out there. I would 10 out of 10.
West Coast particularly.
Yeah, I would love to be there. No, that's great. I love the ISSN, and if I can make it work with my schedule, we'll see me there. So.